Thanks, Nick. Good morning, everyone. We're going to think about that story in a little bit. But first, I want to show you 3 objects that I found around my house or went to buy. Here, first of all, is today's newspaper, the Sunday Times. Other newspapers are available. Look at that, England rugby player winning against South Africa yesterday. There's a newspaper. Here's my second thing. This was actually not planned. A South African T-shirt. A T-shirt, more to the point, a T-shirt. And finally, one of Benji's toys. And here's my question for you. How were all these things made? Or what were they like before they became a newspaper, a T-shirt, and a plastic toy? Let's start with the newspaper. What was a newspaper before it was a newspaper? Who knows? Lorelei. It was a plain piece of paper. And before that? Zach? It was a tree. Yes, I've got a tree here, just so you know what a tree looks like. Well, I've got a piece of wood. So once upon a time, this was something like that. That's quite a big change, isn't it? What about my T-shirt here? What did this T-shirt start off as? Who knows? Anyone got any idea? Thomas? Plants, that's right. It started off something like this. This is cotton wool. It's not actually what it was, but picture on the screen, Ollie, so you can see. Not far away, this 100% cotton T-shirt started out as little balls of cotton. That's quite a change, isn't it? Last one, Benji's plastic fireman. I think it's a fireman. He's got a baseball cap. But this fireman toy, what did this start out as? Who knows? Who has any idea? Anyone? Yes? Plastic, yes. And who knows what plastic started off as? Zach, you got an idea? No. Good honesty. Put your hand up and say no. Thomas. Sorry? Oil, that's right. Now, this is fun. I went to find some oil this week, so you can see. This is the closest I could get to crude oil. You can't actually buy crude oil anywhere, I've discovered. It's very expensive anyway. But look at it. It's gloopy and horrible, and it smells. Somehow, that oil was changed into Benji's toy car. Now, let me ask you another question. Do you think it was easy or hard to change that oil into that toy, or that cotton into that T-shirt, or that wood into that paper? Hands up if you think it was really easy. Really easy? Hands up if you think it was really hard. That's right, it was super duper hard. It took some really clever people one day to work out you could get that into that, or that into that, or that into that. It took an amazing amount of effort and energy. But what a good thing that they did. Imagine if I gave that to Benji to play with. I think he'd quite enjoy it. But the rest of us would know that's terrible. Or imagine I sat down to pick up a stick and read it for a nice afternoon. Or try to walk around wearing cotton, not in a T-shirt. I'd probably get arrested. There's an amazing change that happens from something like that into something like that. And it takes an amazing amount of effort and energy. And here's the point. That story we read that we're going to think about this morning is the story of someone who experienced a change even bigger than that. This man called Saul. You're going to find out, children in your group, we're going to find out here, that he experienced an amazing change. You can get a glimpse of it if you look just at the start of our reading at the end. At the start of our reading, it says that Saul was breathing out murderous threats against the Christians. He wanted to kill them all. By the end of our reading, he was telling people about the very person that had changed all the other Christians' lives. He experienced an amazing change. The question is, how? What did that change look like? What did it do for him? That's what we're going to discover in our groups. Now, please do take your seats. And let's think about that question. What is it that changed this person, Saul? Actually, the change that we see and hear about in this man, Saul, is actually part of the much bigger change, the amazing transformation that happened between the life and death of Jesus Christ and, say, the 3rd or 4th century in the church. Across those 200-300 years, the world was turned upside down in a way that we almost can take for granted these days. But listen to what one historian of the church says about those days. He says this: "Why, among all the cults and philosophies competing in the Greco-Roman world, did Christianity succeed and outstrip all others? Why did it succeed despite getting more severe opposition than any other? Why did it succeed though it had no influential backers in high places, but consisted mainly of the poor and slaves? How did it succeed so completely that it forced the most powerful state in history to come to terms with it, and then outlived the very empire that sought to uproot it? It is clear that at the very beginning of Christianity, there must have occurred a vast release of energy, perhaps unequaled in our history. Without it, the future course of the Christian religion is inexplicable." Now that guy is sort of approaching things from the point of view of being a historian, asking the question, how did these things happen? What's the cause? What's the effect? And he doesn't pin it down, but he says something happened incredible, and a vast release of energy that turned the world upside down when Christianity began. If you like, what goes on with Saul here is that energy sort of on a very personal scale. We see it worked out in this one man's life, that sort of world turning upside down thing that happens across, well, this part of the world, the Mediterranean world, in those first few years. And I think why this is important is because what happened to Saul can happen for anyone. The energy, the power at work in his life, that can be at work in anyone's life. And so as we consider what it is that exactly how it all works for this man Saul, we can see how it might work for us too. Now there's a big caveat to say at this point, which is it might not happen in quite the same way for each of us here as it did for Saul. As you read the book of Acts, one of the things you see is that people experience this energy at work in their life in all kinds of different ways. So, I mean, if you do come across a blinding light that leaves you blind for 3 days, pay attention. Something big could be happening. But equally, just a chapter before this one, we see someone experience this power changing their life through sitting down and opening up their Bible and reading it. So this change happens in all kinds of different ways in different people. But the point is there is something sort of the same across them all. And as we look at the life of Saul and see what happens to him here, we can see how that power, that energy, might just be at work in our lives for the first time, but also ongoing throughout the whole of our lives as we walk with Jesus Christ. As I've been thinking about this and reflecting on these verses, well, actually, the picture we had earlier of oil might sort of help us for a bit of a way in. Not so much in changing oil into plastic, but I'm no scientist or anything here, but as I understand it, the way that sort of fossil fuels are made is that various creatures and material gets put under enormous pressure. And that pressure, it exerts a force that in time produces oil. There are other scientific explanations which go into more detail from that. But the point is, enormous pressure produces oil. It's the same process that produces diamonds. Enormous pressure applied, out pops a diamond in the end. There is something of that sort of pressure or tension that Paul experiences in these verses that out pops an amazing change in his life. Let me try and show you what I mean. The first thing that happens to Paul, it seems, on this road, is that he meets a God who, on the one hand, he cannot control, but on the other hand, he cannot ignore. So Saul, before he becomes a follower of Jesus Christ, we know we have these little glimpses of him so far in Acts. He is a very, very devout Jewish Pharisee, probably. A very devout man who was out and out all about being obedient to God, being zealous for God, and sort of leading charges against anyone who he thought was going against God. And it looks like, without sort of psychologizing Saul's life too much at this stage, it looks like he's someone who's so sure, so fanatically sure about how he can please God that, well, he doesn't sort of worry about going to sleep at night. He's so completely confident that he has God sort of nailed down, if you like. But then he meets this person on the Damascus road. Verse 3, as he neared Damascus on his journey, he's going to lead another kind of crusade against more Christians. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He's literally knocked off his feet by this experience of God. The Bible scholar J.B. Phillips, in the sort of 50s, 60s, decided to try and translate the New Testament into what was described then as vigorous and contemporary language. Perhaps in itself is not the most vigorous and contemporary language for what he was doing, but he described that process of sitting down and sort of translating the Bible into more kind of contemporary language. He said it was like trying to rewire a house with the electricity still turned on. His experience of engaging with God as he was reading and translating the New Testament at first was that sort of energy, that sort of power that he felt he was dealing with, that he was beyond his control. That's what Saul experiences on the Damascus Road. A bigger God than he ever thought was the case. A God who he couldn't sort of put in a box and keep to one side and think, I can go to bed easy tonight because I've done everything I know that this God is happy with me, full stop. Suddenly, a God beyond him, a God bigger than him, a God who he couldn't wrap his arm around and make sense of and keep in one compartment of his life. That's one sort of aspect of this pressure that he experiences. But here's the thing, lots of people through history have experienced God like that. And it hasn't changed them. Kenneth Clark was an art historian, and he produced a famous BBC series called Civilization, amongst other things. And he talks about his own experience of God, meeting God in this kind of Damascus Roads, blinding light sort of way. Listen to what he says. He says, "It took place in the church of San Lorenzo, but it did not seem to be connected with the harmonious beauty of the architecture. I can only say that for a few minutes my whole being was irradiated by a kind of heavenly joy, far more intense than anything I had known before." So you think, well, that's amazing. You've experienced this incredible power and energy at work, but listen to how it goes on. This state of mind lasted for several months. And wonderful though it was, it posed an awkward problem in terms of action. My life was far from blameless. I would have to reform. My family would think I was going mad. And perhaps, after all, it was a delusion, for I was in every way unworthy of receiving such a flood of grace. Gradually the effect wore off, and I made no effort to retain it. I think I was right. I was too deeply embedded in the world to change course. But that I had felt the finger of God, I am quite sure. You know what happened with Kenneth Clark? He got the pressure from, if you like, only one side. He experienced God in the most amazing way, but he walked away from it. He felt the pressure and he said, I don't want anything to do with that. I see what it would mean for my life if I took this seriously. Paul gets the pressure from this side, if you like, but crucially, he also gets pressure from the other side because he sees this can't be explained as a delusion. This can't be just sort of walked away from because it's true. And that's the significance, I think, in part of him asking, "Who are you, Lord?" in verse 5, and the answer, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." We'll come to the second part later on. I am Jesus. Paul, we know, as he reflects on this moment, he comes to believe that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead, and that is the bedrock, the foundation of his faith. So it's not just he has an experience of God that sort of wows him, but he sees that this is real. That Jesus Christ, this man who lived and died, also rose again, so proving that he is God's anointed king, the Son of God, which is the very thing that Saul starts telling people when he is converted. Towards the end of our passage, verse 20, at once he began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God. You see how it works for him. He gets pressure from both sides, an experience of God that blows him away. But also this conviction alongside it. This isn't just a delusion or something I've made up. This is true. And when those things kind of work together, it changes him. It changes his life forever. Now, I think this sort of thinking maybe kind of lacking in the way that we often think about our faith, Christianity, in the world generally today. It's very easy for all of us to, if you like, curate the world that we live in. More often than ever, we're able to control the things we read, the things we listen to, the things we watch. And we have an aversion to almost anything that we find disagreeable, find something that sort of challenges the way that we think. Study after study have shown that this is one of the big problems of a world that we live in. We control what we watch and hear and read and so on. And so anything that might be disagreeable, we filter out. That is a deadly thing to do when we come to church, when we come to the Bible. If we have an aversion to a God who disagrees with us in any way, then we might miss out on something like what Saul experienced. We might miss out on God really encountering us. If there is a God who's big enough and powerful enough to create the world and to send his Son into the world to redeem us, then maybe, just maybe, he might have some things about which he disagrees with us. And he might want to tell us about those things. So when we hear things that we find disagreeable, even when we read them in the Bible or hear them at church, would our instinct be to say, I'm going to walk away from this, that pressure, I'm leaving out of this door? Or like Saul, perhaps say, hang on, maybe this isn't just sort of difficult, but also true. And when those two pressures collide, perhaps it will bring the sort of change that Saul experiences. So that's the first thing that happens in this passage, I think. Saul meets a God who he can't control, much bigger than he thought, but also can't ignore because it's true, it's real. The second sort of pressure thing going on here, though, I think is something like this, that Saul hears an invitation from this God that is both wonderful, but also deeply uncomfortable. And again, it's when he experiences both of those things together that God's power sort of works in his life. Let me try and show you what I mean. So verse 5, who are you, Lord? He asks. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, he replied. That little sentence, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, was dynamite for the way that Saul thought about God from this point on. We've sort of thought a little bit about the I am Jesus. This isn't a fairy tale. This is real. Jesus is risen from the dead, and he's alive, and I can know him. But the whom you are persecuting bit, for Saul, becomes something incredibly powerful as he thinks on it. Because what that means, well, Saul hasn't been, he thinks, persecuting Jesus. He's been chasing around Christians to get rid of them. But when Jesus comes to him and says, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting, he realizes Christians, these followers of this man Jesus, are so intimately connected to Jesus, somehow, so bound to Jesus, that when people like Saul attack them, they are attacking him. And this became, if you like, really the heart of Paul's whole way of thinking about God. That, flip it round, once you become a follower of Jesus yourself, you are as closely bound to Jesus Christ, you're as closely brought in to fellowship with God as you could possibly imagine. As close as someone who you see suffering and you're suffering with them. Closer than that even. I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. The invitation, the offer of Christianity is to become so closely bound to God, so deeply in fellowship with him like that. And again, as Paul reflects on this moment, time and again we hear him saying that this is what's happened to him. When it sort of all kind of clicks and it becomes his faith. So in his letter to the Galatians, some famous words, you might well know them, you might even have memorized them. He says, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. That's the intimacy that Saul experiences as he comes to know God in this new way. And this is so wonderful because it is the very thing that we were made for. To be so deeply connected with God. Well, it is the deepest longing, the deepest cry, the deepest consolation of every human heart. Every now and then you get sort of what one philosopher talked about as signals of transcendence, by which he meant little sort of bleeps on the radar that there is something more going on in our world. Even if we don't think there's a God anywhere, every now and then little bleeps come through that there's something bigger that I could somehow be connected with. And, you know, if you put some stirring string music underneath that and some powerful words, you can make a lot of money because it moves people. You watch almost any film and you'll find that moment where, if you like, the characters and we ourselves are, oh, wow, there's something bigger here that I can connect with. For Saul, there is a reality to that sort of, wow, there's something bigger, and it's God himself. And it's the most wonderful invitation that he knew. So it's wonderful, but it's also really uncomfortable. Because right alongside that sense of deep connection with God, well, hear what God says to Ananias about what will happen to Saul next. The Lord said to Ananias, "Go, this man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name." And in one sense, you can sort of see the logic of this. Because if what the invitation to Saul and to us is to be bound up with Jesus Christ, closely, deeply intimate with him, well, what do we know about the life and ministry of Jesus? His life was an experience of suffering even to the point of death. Now, Saul, in one sense, has this sort of privileged position, particular position, where God shows him exactly the way you're going to suffer for my name. But in a sort of follow-on sense, it's true for every one of us as we come to know God in this way, this new way like Saul does. Well, alongside that offer of fellowship, of coming into the family, of being connected to the source of all our deepest longings and so on, is also the guarantee, the promise of suffering in this world. Now, we have to be careful here because there's a mystery in the sort of ways that we suffer. So Saul has God specifically saying to him, "I will show him how much he must suffer for my name." It's rare that the ordinary Christian life is full of those moments where God says, "I'm going to show you what you must suffer." But the general point that the joy and the wonder and the deep fellowship of belonging to God don't sort of happen to us disconnected from real suffering in our lives, I think is a true one. And this isn't the only thing to say about the kind of pain that we might experience if we give our lives to Jesus Christ. But it, I think, is part of the answer. It comes back to that point about pressure. For Saul, he can't duck the fact that this God is real and that this offer is good. But if he's encountering a God who is bigger than him, then maybe there are things in his life that God will want to change and bring change in. And maybe, just maybe, that experience of change coming in his own life will be a costly and painful one. But precisely as he experiences that sort of pressure on him, well, God is transforming him into something valuable and beautiful. A diamond. Again, he says just as much later on in his life as he's reflecting on how he's encountered God. At the end of the book of 2 Corinthians, a later letter that he wrote, he speaks specifically again about an experience of suffering. He calls it, well, he says, I was given a thorn in my flesh. We don't know exactly what he's talking about. A messenger of Satan to torment me. Some kind of experience, physical, visceral, of pain. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Again, for Saul here, he kind of has a much clearer sense than we probably will about the specific suffering that God calls him to. But do you see what he's saying in that sort of reflection there? As I've experienced this physical pain and weakness, I've understood more deeply and more wonderfully how God's power is sufficient for me. It's enough for me. I don't need to be strong myself. I understand more than ever that God is the strong one. And it seems to me that that is an unparalleled resource available to us if we're followers of Jesus Christ. Everyone in the world is going to suffer at some point or other. You only have to live long enough. But for people like Saul, when they experience God in this way, they find a new way to think about it. And that, in the end, it seems to me, is how Christianity triumphs all those years ago, and how it goes on triumphing, if you like, today. And how it works in every individual's heart and life. We encounter a big, uncontrollable God. We might come to him thinking, I know what you're about, I know how to get in your good books, I don't have to stay there, I've got this worked out. And then we find that he knocks us to the ground. But we don't walk away from that because it's true. And yet, even as he leads us into things that cause us pain, makes us experience hardship even, we can do so like Saul, knowing that we have been brought into the most intimate fellowship with God, and that he might even use those experiences that we find hard to transform us for our good. If those pressures, if you like, all come together in your life, then like Saul, you can be transformed. You might not be breathing out murderous threats, but wherever you're coming from, God can take you and, in the best way, turn your life upside down, or better, turn your life the right way up again, and lead you through a life of renewal and transformation, just like Saul experienced. Well, let's be quiet for a few moments, and then Nick is going to come and lead us in prayer, both in response to what we've been hearing and also for some other things in the life of our church. So let's be quiet and reflect. Over to Nick.